I'm Julie Fei Fan Balzer, your host for Make It Artsy. Collage combines materials and mediums to create something entirely new. And today, all of our makers share their favorite collage technique. So let's begin with one of my favorite collage techniques, which is using stencils to transform paper. So this piece of paper here, which is beautiful and decorated and colorful, well, it's exactly the same piece of paper that you see right here. If you look really closely, you'll be able to see that same pattern is underneath. So I have a lot of scrapbook paper left over, and I don't necessarily like it, but what I do like is to transform it, and I'm going to show you just how easy that is. So I am working with a couple different kinds of, scrapbook paper. It can be whatever you want. It can be double-sided, single-sided, it doesn't matter. And when you've picked your paper you want to work with, we're going to work with some acrylic paints. Now the first step here is incredibly complicated and difficult. Just kidding. All you're going to do is just smush some paint on there. Now, one of the keys here is I want to let some of the pattern show through. I don't actually want this to be completely opaque. The other thing is, without cleaning my brush, I'm adding in some other colors so that the colors kind of bridge and jump, and anywhere that it's really opaque, I want to move away from so that I do then get a much thinner area. I do want to work with a dry brush. Why? Well, it's because the dry brush really gives you this kind of nice streaky, strokey look, whereas a wet brush is also going to make the paper very, very wet. So I'm just jumping around on all my colors, trying to get some nice color in there and not thinking too hard about what's going on. I want this to be kind of spontaneous. This is also a process you can do in stages. So you could take 100 pieces of paper and you could line them up and you could just do this sort of first base layer of painting and then come back later. Now, if I get ugly colors like brown in there, who cares? Rock on. This is all gonna get prettified, if that can be a word, in just a moment. So I'm just adding some paint, and when I'm satisfied with how much is covered or left exposed, then I'm ready to move on to the next step. So the next step is going to be stenciling. And there are so many unbelievably gorgeous stencils out there. One tip I want to give you about stenciling is I like to use stencils that have multiple patterns on them. And you can see, so for example, here's another stencil that has multiple different patterns on them. It just makes it really easy to get a lot of different things. Even this little face stencil, again, you can use the face, but you can also use all of the dots. And what I mean by that is, okay, if we go ahead and take this stencil out and bring it over here. So the first thing about stenciling is cosmetic wedge sponges, the kind you use to do your makeup. Those are the greatest stencil tool. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna take that wide end and we're simply going to dab it into the paint. And I like to mix a couple colors of paint at the same time. So I'm gonna go ahead into my two colors, my white and my red, and sometimes I get crazy and even mix a third color, but we'll save that. And then I don't put a lot of paint on there. It's a very dry sponge. So now if I go ahead and I pounce up and down, I'll get a very clean result. If you like messy, then use a lot of paint. But if you like a nice clean result, then this is a great technique for you. And you can see there are those dots. And I did not use the profile at all. And in fact, if anybody looked at this, they would have no idea that there was a profile here. They would just think that I was using dots. Now you'll notice that there are several sizes of dots on this stencil, and that may not seem like it's particularly important, but it actually is important because using the same shape in many different sizes is extraordinarily useful. So towards that end, one of the things that I tend to do when I pick stencils is, if I can, I try to get both sizes of a stencil. So I can use the big and the small size, and that way I can get a lot of rhythm. So for instance, if I take this and I simply run down here, let's get some paint on there. Mixing yellow and blue is gonna give me a nice green. And let's say I wanna get this big old sort of, I don't know what you would call this, sort of eye shapes or leaf shapes, or I guess they could be anything that your imagination wanted them to be. So I'm just gonna go ahead down that channel, okay? And you can see it looks really cool. But if I also now bring in the smaller ones and do the same thing in there, then what's gonna happen is it's gonna start to create rhythm through repetition. And you can see, and of course, if that's too short, I can go ahead and I can extend that. because I am the boss of my stencils and they are not the boss of me. Another thing that helps to really transform your paper and make it look fabulous is if you add a couple hand-painted patterns. So I'm gonna take a small brush and I'm dipping it in water and then just wiping it off. I'm gonna go ahead into some paint, and now I'm gonna add a little bit of repetition. There you go. It's just a simple dash line, and I'm going right up to the edge and right over. I'm letting my brush run dry, letting it all be cool, and I'm going right over my stencil marks. And now by having that rhythm between the printed paper, the paint on top of it, the stenciling, the hand-drawn pattern, whatever that is, what's gonna happen is you're gonna create an incredibly complex and interesting piece of paper. Now, why are we letting so much of the other paper show through underneath? Well, it's because that makes it, again, much more visually interesting. And you can see how I'm filling in the circles, but not particularly well, and that's on purpose, because I still want all those layers to show through. One of the keys to working in layers in collage is really to make sure that you let things show through, that you're not covering things up entirely. So then once you have all this beautiful paper, what do you do with it? That's always the great question. And collage is the perfect place to put it. So if you look over here, you'll see I have a couple pieces of scrapbook paper that I've altered, and you can see that they're, you know, big, huge pieces of paper, but you'll notice this one has several notches cut out of it. And if we head over here to the finished piece, you can see this piece of paper came directly out of here. This little piece of paper came directly out of here, this triangle too. All of it did. And so when I'm creating a collage, I like to have all these different stenciled and stamped images. You can also stencil directly onto your collage. You can see all these little dots and lines came from stencils. So I hope you will give it a try. I hope you'll embrace stenciling and transforming supplies you already have. Stencils are a great tool for making magic.